Welcome back to episode 17 of the Rugby History Project. I'm your host Hattie, and today we're looking at how it all began, the first ever women's international test match, and the legacy of the Utrecht Shield. Remember to like, rate and subscribe wherever you're listening or watching today's episode, as it really does help with growing the project. On the 13th of June 1982, the Netherlands and France took part in the first ever women's international test match. Whilst the Netherlands lost at home, France became the first ever lineal world title holders, a title they will fight to regain this Sunday against England in the final game of the 2026 Women's Six Nations. On a Saturday evening in June 1982, a group of 21 French women undertook a 500-kilometre coach journey to the Dutch city of Utrecht. At 3 p.m. the following day, they, along with their Dutch counterparts, made history as the first ever female international rugby union players. The match at Sportpark Strelon sparked a legacy, that of the Utrecht Shield, with France being its first holders. The women's game in France was well established by 1982, with some teams closing in on 2 decades of history and multiple leagues having run for over 10 years. Dutch women's rugby was far newer, although rugby in the Netherlands was far newer on the men's side as well. The rugby club Wageningen had formed in the men's side in 1970. To celebrate their 5-year anniversary, the club decided to host a women's game featuring the partners and female relatives of their male players. The success of the game, which was only meant to be a novelty, resulted in club sides being set up across the country. Despite its later start, support for the women's game in the Netherlands was enthusiastic. Several university teams existed, and unusually for the era, it was governed by the National Rugby Union, the NRB. The first women's test match was the brainchild of 2 revolutionary rugby figures. Dutch rugby official Leo van Herwijnen devoted his life to growing the game in the Netherlands. He was heavily involved in the founding of several clubs and even set up his own foundation, the aim of which is to preserve Dutch rugby history. However, in the 1980s, he was in the infancy of his rugby advocacy. Whilst van Herwijnen had come to the game late, only discovering it when his children began to play, his French counterpart Henri Flechon was somewhat of a rogue stalwart in his home nation. Flechon was a respected referee with the FFR, the French National Union, until he refused to abide by the FFR ban on union referees officiating women's rugby matches. At the time, women's rugby was governed by the Association Française de Rugby de Féminin, a separate organisation, which legally meant it was kind of possible for the FFR to enact a ban. However, Flechon disagreed with the concept of a ban, as it would effectively stop safe play in the women's game. Whilst the FFR referee ban fell apart, Flechon found himself central to the AFRF administration, as he was quickly elevated to organisation president. 1982 was panning out to be a big year for the NRB, as they were celebrating their 50th anniversary. Similarly, it would be a big year for women's rugby in France, as the AFRF would be absorbed into the FFR at the end of the year under Flechon's guidance. Flechon's reputation as an administrator of the women's game had reached the Netherlands, and as such, van Herwijnen reached out to set up a meeting to discuss best practice for governing the women's game. Both sides were impressed by the other's approach, with Flechon impressed with how the NRB accepted women, and van Herwijnen impressed with the overall structure of the women's game in France. As a result of the meeting, the Dutch decided to set up a women's national team and invited the French to take part in a match to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the NRB. Despite the tight turnaround time, with just a few months between the invitation and the match itself, both sides were able to put together competitive sides. The Dutch held regional trials to select their playing pool and held training games between April and June 1982, whilst the French selected a representative side from 5 clubs and conducted a singular training camp. While some of the Dutch players had never played a game of 15-a-side rugby union, many of the French players were incredibly experienced, with the French outside centre Monique Fraisse having played over 12 years with the modern powerhouse Toulouse. Somewhat unsurprisingly, the first half of the game was extremely competitive, with neither side's attack managing to get through the other's defence. In the second half, however, the more experienced French side pulled through, with winger Isabelle Deschamps scoring the game's only try. With tries only being worth 4 points at the time, the final score was 0-4. Representing France meant that women's rugby would be able to move forward. It was also a personal reward. We were there, we were not going to back down. I recall the shape of the Dutch players, all dressed in orange. They were young, tall, strong, and they passed the ball very well. Monique Fraisse, French outside centre, in 2020. Despite the unions being the ones to organise the game, the players themselves paid for their jerseys, transport and even accommodation. The French players wore white rather than their traditional blue, and were not allowed to wear the Gallic rooster on their chest, instead wearing a tricolour stripe down the arms of their jerseys. The Dutch wore their traditional orange. However, as we can see with Hanneke Brouwer's jersey from the return fixture the following year, they were repurposed football jerseys. Neither side backed down or away from the international game, as they played return fixtures in 1983 and 1984, both won by France. In 1984, the Netherlands faced Sweden for the first time, and the following year, France played Italy. The game in Riccione, Italy, was the first time in which a team other than France or the Netherlands competed for the Utrecht Shield. Whilst the draw meant that the French retained their title, it was a landmark game. What if every result mattered? What if rugby had a central unifying trophy, one that followed the game itself, moving match by match across continents and competitions? It wouldn't replace existing trophies, it would strengthen international rugby, ensuring that every result matters beyond rankings or tournament tables. Dave Alge, Guardian of the Utrecht Shield 2026. The Utrecht Shield, like her brother the Rayburn Shield, is the brainchild of Dave Alge. The Shields tracked the lineal world champions match by match since 1982 and 1871 respectively. The idea to track the lineal world title holders began after the 2007 Men's Rugby World Cup, when Dave's beloved All Blacks exited the tournament early. Although a much trickier task, he also began tracking the women's data too, the motivation to do so increasing after watching the Black Ferns dominate the 2010 Women's Rugby World Cup in person. As of 2026, Dave has devoted almost 2 decades of his spare time and a fair amount of cash to the project. Whilst the Shields now form a limited company in order to deal with British bureaucracy, Dave himself stresses that the Shields really belong to the players and the public. Whilst the ultimate goal would be to have the Shields exchanged on pitch following a steal, for now, you can find Dave and his kids at games with the Shield, offering stickers and the opportunity to take a photo. I've always loved women's rugby, and I've always been a bit of a stats nerd, but really it's the stories and the connections that get me. The Utrecht Shield lets us take those trailblazers from 1982 and draw a line all the way through to today and beyond. Those women gave so much joy, and they deserve to be connected to every great player who's come since. If we can make rugby more fun, why wouldn't we? Dave Alge, Guardian of the Utrecht Shield 2026. England's Red Roses are the current holders of the lineal world title, having taken the Shield after beating Canada in October 2024. At 18 defences, the run is equal to their best ever run in the mid-90s, and only 2 games short of the Black Ferns' record of 20. However, on the 17th of May 2026, they will face the French in Bordeaux. Having conceded just 49 points in 4 games, the French are on a defensive hot streak. In comparison, the Red Roses are facing an injury crisis at lock and have conceded bonus points from the Welsh and Italian sides for the first time in their history. If the French managed to beat their greatest rivals in Bordeaux, not only would they win a Grand Slam, but the Utrecht Shield would be returned to them almost 3 years after they last held it. This would top off a historic campaign, which started with the recognition of the 1982 squad at their opening game against Italy. I've had the Utrecht game/Shield on my to-do list for a hot while, and seeing as we're headed for a Shield showdown in the final match of the Six Nations, it felt apt to cover it as part of my Six Nations series, even if technically it's not the Six Nations. If you'd like to check out my other articles I've made in the wider series, you can check those out on my channel, on my website, or wherever you're consuming this. I've also recently created some Just Say No to Dainty Lady Ball stickers in protest of the ball trial, which will take place later this year. You can find those on my Redbubble, and you can also check out my piece on the history of the rugby ball as well, which has some more information. You can find that, it's just called Chasing the Egg. I'd also like to give a huge thank you to Dave for helping me out with the details about the Utrecht Shield and providing lots and lots of great photos for today's post. If you head over to his website, therayburnutrechtshield.com, you can find great statistics and other great snapshots of the Shield's adventures. I hope that you've enjoyed this post. If you'd like more regular updates, please check out my Instagram, Twitter and/or Blue Sky. I also now have a Facebook page. I'll keep plugging it. I don't know why I have it. It's just there if you want to have a look. You can also catch me podding every Tuesday morning with Rap or with Women's Rugby Treehouse somewhat regularly. A written version of this episode is also available on my website, therugbyhistoryproject.com, which is where you can also find all of my references and footnotes, blah 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 blah, all of the important stuff to me. You can also upgrade to the Historian tier to support the project or give a one-off donation. I really do apologise if I've pronounced anything wrong. The Dutch language is very hard. And so is the French, but mostly the Dutch. What the hell?